Hello and welcome to my first build that I'm sharing on video with you guys. I might be talking to myself at this stage, but I'm hoping that won't always be the case. So the kit we're going to tackle first, and we're going to treat as a total novice beginner's kit, is this lovely Airfix Boulton Defiant, which is a 1/72 scale fighter aircraft. And the reason I picked this kit is partly it's a relatively new toolkit, so I know that the build's going to be fairly straightforward and easy. Airfix's new toolkits are really good kits to build. Secondly, the skill level is 1, so it's aimed at entry level. And it has a really nice paint scheme option of the Night Fighter, which is all over black, so that reduces the amount of different coloured paints you need. And also, if I show you the instructions here, has a really nice, cool shark's mouth on it, which I think is really good. One of the interesting things about this aircraft is that it's one of only 2 fighters I'm aware of that ever had a gun turret as well. So the idea of this plane was that it could get in and interrupt the bombers coming over to bomb the cities and towns in the UK and cause havoc, which was moderately successful. But then was used in a night fighter role with a bit more success. So my plan is that I will take you through this stage by stage. So if you've never built a model kit before, you can follow what I do, and at the end of it, have a completed model kit. You can then transfer those skills onto your next kit, and I will build a skill level 1, and then I'm going to build skill levels 2, 3, and 4, all Airfix, and take you through that process. You are going to need some tools, but we'll talk about that as we go. And first thing you're going to need is some space to use. So and some form of cutting mat. So you can get these in art shops, places like Hobbycraft. You can get them online on eBay. You don't need a big one like I've got to start off with. A little A4 one will set you back £2 or £3, but you're definitely going to need one of those. And you're also going to need some form of craft knife. So something like this. This particular one is an X-Acto one, which I bought when I was 15. So that's been working with me for 30 years and still going strong. Obviously, I've changed the blades a little bit. But yeah, a craft knife with a number 11 blade is ideal to start off with. And you're also going to need some form of emery board for sanding. So if I just show you, so I have a collection here. You can buy these online, and I'm not specifically highlighting a brand here, but if you go onto eBay, you'll see packs of these things. And if you can get a coarse, a medium, and a fine grit, that'll do everything you need for now. And then you're going to need some paints and some paint brushes and some glue. Now, some kits, if you go onto the Airfix website, you'll see they have some starter sets. Be careful of those because not all of them are skill set 1. So just make sure that when you're looking at them, that you're looking at getting a skill set 1 if you've not built a kit before. But they're helpful because they do come with some paint and some paint brushes, typically 1 or 2 paint brushes. And they'll also come with some tube glue. And I can tell you, first of all, what you need to do with tube glue is once you've opened it, you put it in the bin, because it's not very good. It strings, it gets on your fingers, and it ruins your model. What you need is something like this, which is a liquid poly cement. Again, you can find these online. And maybe something like this, thin cement. If you go on the Airfix website, they have their own versions, which are perfectly good. So some liquid cement, a knife, some abrasive sticks, and that is all you need to get going. Right, so next stage. We've now washed the parts, and they've been dabbed dry and allowed to air dry, and so they're nice and clean and ready to go. We've left the glass parts in the bag, and we'll continue to leave them in the bag until we need to use them. That just prevents them getting scratched, which we don't want at this stage. So we can put those to one side. Put your parts to one side. First thing we need to do is get familiar with the instructions. So if we open up the page, Airfix's most recent instructions are really easy to use. They've always led the way in instructions, in my opinion, but each step is very clear. It shows you what paints you need, colours you need to be using. It shows you the part number there. So C4 refers to frame C. It says sprue C. So some people call them frames, some people call them sprues, but effectively it means this bit that holds the parts. So sprue C, and then it gives you a part number 4. So that bit there is that bit there, number 4. Yep, and it's telling us that we need to paint it with number 56. So we'll come back to paints in a minute. So it tells you what you need, and then on your next steps, it shows you where those parts were fitted. So the red bits show where those were located. So in part 3, we're putting part 1 and part 2 together. And it's as simple as that. If you follow the instructions in their steps initially, you won't have any problems. As you get more advanced, you can look at it and go, actually, I want to build it in a different sequence. And you will find that there are things that we call sub-assemblies. So, for example, the gun turret there gets made on its own. So that's a sub-assembly. So while bits are drying, you could build that, for example. The propeller is a sub-assembly. Pretty much that's a sub-assembly. Pretty much the rest of it isn't. But this is a relatively small, uncomplicated kit, so it should be fairly straightforward. So the other thing that the instructions are going to point out is where you need to use the decals. So here we can see in the square box, decal number 1. So if we go to the decal sheet, decal number 1, so that's the dials and bits for the dashboard. And what they've done with the decals is they've got a set here, which is common to all the aircraft you could possibly build with this kit. And then they have the night fighter type and then the day fighter type. And you choose which one you're going to do, and that dictates which decals you're going to use. And then what you do is you keep these in this spares box. So if you ever need a roundel, in 172, you've always got a spare one. And then once you've finished building it and you come to put your decals on, there is a separate sheet which shows you where to place others, which can be done once it's completed. So you're going to have to make a decision at this time whether you're going to have your plane with its wheels down, the undercarriage down, or whether you're going to have it flying. If you're going to have it flying, you're going to need some form of stand. Again, if you go on the Airfix website, you can buy those separately. They're no longer included like they used to be many years ago. But that keeps the cost down. A lot of people display it wheels down. We will be building it with the wheels down. Because this fighter is unusual and has a gun turret, it also has 2 figures with it. So we will be tackling that as well. So the instructions also tell you the paint numbers that you need for painting the model. And that'll be different depending on which version that you want to paint. So you can see here, there's quite a long list of paints needed because we've got a camouflage pattern and a different undercarriage, and then we've got a white nose. Whereas there's a lot less here. We've got the gunmetal for the guns, we've got the black for the main fuselage, both the top and the bottom, and then we've got the yellow for the tips on the propellers. But there's actually more colours than that needed, and when you look at the box, it does actually list all the paints that you need, and it'll say, see here it says B, it says here A and B, you need those colours, and A only needs those colours, and the pilot needs those colours. So if you're not going to use the pilot, you know you don't need to get those paints, but you do know that you need all of those paints. So the instructions here aren't dealing with the interior cockpit surfaces. So there's actually 3 paints listed there, but there's 6 paints listed there that you need, plus another 3, making it 9 if you're going to paint the pilots, which we're going to do. So the paint numbers refer to Humbrol's own brand of enamel and acrylic paints. But if you go on the internet and Google Humbrol 24, it will tell you that it's matte yellow, and you can always buy another brand, or if you've got paints already because you've made 1 or 2 models, you can go and find the right paints. Okay, let's get on with the build. So step 1 is asking us to take off from the sprue parts A2, C9 and C4. So let's do that. So A2 is this one here. I'm going to take my knife, and how we're going to remove it from the sprue is we're going to take the knife and we're going to cut away from the part onto the cutting mat like that. And that will separate it, leaving a tag which we'll need to clean up. So that's one way of doing it. I use side cutters, which you can buy online fairly cheaply, which cut through the sprue and make it quicker and, in my opinion, a bit safer. But you can also use nail clippers. Let me just find mine. So this is perhaps a little safer for younger modelers. So you get a pair of nail scissors and you can cut the part like that. So once you've removed the part, you should have your part there with 4 or a number of little tabs. We call these tabs. So that's the bit that's been left behind. So we need to remove those. So we're going to do that with our craft knife. So again, holding the part flat on the cutting mat and using a knife to get close, we'll just trim that down, making sure that we don't actually cut any of the part that we don't want trimmed off. And then when we've done that, we need to get a little sanding stick and just smooth that flat. I'll remove these and then we'll have a look at sanding. So I've now removed the 3 parts, and you'll notice that this part here, number C4, I've left the sprue on the bottom. So I've cut the bit of the sprue off the frame and left it attached. And the reason I do that is it's going to allow me to hold the part while we paint it. So this surface here goes into the part here and is actually the surface that glue will go on. So we don't want paint on that anyway. So this is going to allow me to hold the part while we paint it, which makes it easier. Now this part doesn't have a surface that I can hold easily. So when we paint this, we're going to use a little bit of blue tack to help us out. But before we do that, we've cleaned the parts up. I just want to test fit them. We call this dry fitting because we're not using any glue. So what we do is we just put them in place so that we understand how that part fits. We look at the instructions, and if we look at the instructions, you can see we can check the orientation, check that it's in place okay, check that we've cleaned it up so it fits properly. We can do that with both those parts. Because this is a new kit, it all fits together very nicely. So we know that those are ready to go. So to complete the first step, we need to paint those parts. Now, normally I always prime my models, but because we're going to treat this as the first time you've ever built a model, we're going to assume you've not got primer, and you can actually get away with painting a model without primer. I wouldn't recommend it. And as soon as you can get some primer, you need to do that. But when we build our second kit, which will be a skill level 2 kit, that's when we'll look at using primer. Okay, so the paint colours that we need are 78, which is cockpit green, and we're using that on the interior bit there. This part is 85, which I need to look up, and this part is 78 cockpit green, and this surface here is 56, which I think is gunmetal or silver. I think need to find out what that is. So I'm going to find out what the paints are, and we'll get it painted up. So we're now ready for painting, and I just wanted to take you through what you need for that. So I'm using acrylic paints, and I would recommend, if you're starting out in the hobby, that you also use acrylic paints. Now, Airfix do the Humbrol brand of acrylic paints, and they use the same numbers as the instructions, so that makes that nice and easy. I happen to have quite a lot of paints from different projects over the years, so I'll tend to use up paints that I've already got, which is the only reason I'm not using Humbrol paints here. So the three paints that we need right now are aluminium, black, and interior cockpit green. So one of the advantages of using acrylic paints is you can thin it with just ordinary tap water. Now, as you progress through the hobby, you'll find that you probably want to use proper thinners and bits and pieces like that. Everyone does it slightly differently, but we're going to do it with water, and that's perfectly fine. The only paint brand I wouldn't thin with water is Tamiya. It tends to go a little bit grainy and lumpy, the paint, if you thin it with water. So, but most others are fine. Okay, so what we're going to do is give the paint a really, really good shake. Now this particular one, you can hear the rattle, has a little paintball in it, which helps agitate it. So what happens is, as paint sits on the shelf, you can see here, it separates, and you see that sort of white, and the pigment in the paint sits on the bottom. So we're just giving that a proper good mix. In some paints, so if I show you this, for example, this is the yellow we'll use on the propeller tips, which is a Tamiya paint. For this, shaking that isn't enough. So I have an electric paint stirrer, but you might want to get yourself something like a cocktail stick to give it a good mix. But for these, just a good shake is enough, because these paints are a bit thinner, and some of them, you can see this one says air on it, and that's because that's been thinned ready to go into an airbrush. But you can brush paint it as well, and we'll be brush painting this. An airbrush is something we'll use at skill 3 and above. So we take a small amount of paint, and you only need a small amount. There we go. My nozzle's dried up a little bit, so I'll sort that later. And my rule of thumb is, use as big a brush as you can get away with using, so you've got fewer brush strokes. So on this one, I ordinarily would have used a wider brush than this, because I'm not too worried about how neat it is at this stage. But I'm painting this as well, so I don't want to go any wider. So we're going to use this brush, which is a number 2, and we're going to dip it in the water and get the bristles wet, like so, and then just dip it in the paint. Now you see, I put some paint in a palette. If you've not got a paint palette yet, milk bottle top, perfect for it. And when you've finished, you can wash it and use it again. And it's also great for putting glue in. It's got all sorts of good uses. You'll also see that I've got blue tack here. So this part here, when I paint that in a minute black, we'll use the blue tack to be able to hold the part and paint it. And the surface that's in contact with the blue tack is the bit that's going to be glued on, so we don't need to paint that anyway. So we're painting number 78 to start with, and as we look at the instructions, that starts here. So we're going to paint anything that looks like an inside surface. If we've got that wrong, we can always go over it later. I'm not sure how far up is going to be visible, so always safe than sorry, and do a little bit more than you possibly need. I'm going to let that dry for a moment. So I know that I've not got good coverage there, it's quite thin. If I'd had primer down, that would have been slightly better. And then we're going to do the same here. Now the 56 is this top surface here, and that's the aluminium. So we're just going to paint up to that in the green, but try not to paint over it, because that will just show under the aluminium, and we'll have to do more coats of aluminium to correct it. And then this edge here, I'm not sure whether that's glued in place or not, so I'm going to just edge my bets and paint over that for now. You can always scrape it off later. It's the plan. There we go. So that's the first coats down. So I'm then just going to give my paintbrush a swirl in the water. That gets the worst of it off. I've not cleaned the brush. I just don't want too much paint on it drying off. And we'll leave that there for a sec. And while that's drying, we can now tackle the black. Now the part we're painting there is much smaller, so I'm going to use a smaller brush. And you can see I'm just using a very small blob of black paint. And the reason is I'm going to need no more than maybe 2 coats of the black. So putting the water on the brush just helps add a little bit of thinner to it, thins the paint a little bit. So I always, you'll notice, give the paint a little bit of a stir. What you want to try and do is not get paint too far up the bristle, that's sort of halfway up and no further. Just makes it easier to clean your brush later on. And we're just going to paint that in. So the trick is to not put too much on your brush and visit the part with the paint frequently, rather than putting a load on and then trying to smooth it out over the part, because you're not going to get even coverage if you do that, and you're probably going to have excess paint and paint runs and bits of drips and all sorts of stuff. So we want to avoid that. Try not to paint any surfaces that you're going to put glue on. Don't worry though if you do, because it'll easily scrape off. Now again, if we'd use primer, my tendency is to use white primer as it happens. We'd probably use 2 coats. Because we've not used primer, this first coat effectively becomes your undercoat, your primer coat. So we'll just leave that. So we might need 3 coats. So give that a swirl. Now that cockpit green is dry enough for me to go over again. I've not got much paint there. So what you'll see as we go over it a second time, the paint becomes more solid. And when we do it a third and final time, we should have a nice even colour there. Going to need a little bit more paint. Sometimes these nozzles get a little bit clogged up, and you need to just take them off and give them a clean, or put a bit of wire or a needle down and just unblock them. And because we've washed the parts, I've got no issues there with the paint sticking on. So we're now at step 10 in the instructions, and it gives us an option of part B6 or part B7. I don't know what the difference is because it doesn't really make it clear, so I don't know whether one is when it's in flight and one's landed. So just choose the one you fancy. B6 makes the plane look a little bit sleeker, so I think I might go with that. So yeah, I'm going to do B6. So I'm going to remove that, and then I'll come back to you when we're ready to glue that in. So I'm going to take that off, clean it up, and then I'll be back. So actually, having dry fitted the part B6, I didn't like the look of it. So that's the one that seems to be in a down position, and it goes underneath there, and I'm sure that's right, but I didn't like the look. So I then took part B7 off, and I like the look of that more, so I'm going to use part B7. So just dry fit it like I've done, make sure it fits okay and you know what you're doing, and then we're just going to put a little bit of glue on this lip here on each side of the plane. There we go. A bit on that side and a bit on that side. And carefully pop that in place. Once it's in place, we're just going to leave it there. Make sure it's nice and square. So that completes step 10. So that then takes us to step 11 and 12, which are air intakes. And we're going to have to paint these parts before we assemble them on the aircraft. So I'm going to take these parts off and clean them up. And then I'll come back to you when we're ready to paint and assemble. So we've glued the wings on, and we now have something that definitely looks like an aeroplane. Our next steps are 11 and 12, which are air scoops that go underneath the aeroplane. And we need to paint these before we attach them on. So these two parts here in step 11 are painted aluminium, and the inside of that part is painted black, if you're doing the night version, which we are. And the same with step 12. That's aluminium, the inside is black. So we're going to paint these two parts, step 11 and step 12, and do them at the same time. Note that here there's an option to add a stand, but you have to buy them separately, and you'll need to drill holes. We're not going to do that. We're going to build it with the wheels down so it stands up on its own right. So, excuse the croaky voice. My cough's left me with a bit of a sore throat this morning, but we will muddle on. Simple thing like a sore throat is not going to stop me building a model. So let's crack on with step 11 and 12. And what I've done is I've already removed the parts from the sprue, but as you can see, I've left them attached here so I can hold them, because these bits don't need to be painted anyway. The same with that one. And then these bits need to be painted black on the inside, and we'll mount them on some blue tack to do that. So I've decanted some paint, as we've done before. And we're just going to paint the front and back surfaces of these parts. As soon as you get paint on it, you can see there's some very fine mesh detail moulded into this. Now you could, if you wanted, when these parts have dried, give it a black wash like we did with the pilot, which would bring out some of that detail. In fact, I might show you how to do that in a sec. On these parts you'll see it says front and back, which is referenced in the instructions. So we're just painting those two surfaces, which will face outwards on the part once it's built. Let's just do this little one as well. Again, we're only doing that facing surface because the back's not seen, and we're putting glue on the other surfaces. Okay, and whilst that's drying, we can paint these other parts. You can see I've not done the clean up yet. We'll do that after because we're painting inside. We won't be touching it, so that's all fine. And as always, if we're not sure what's going to be seen and what's not, we paint everything. So that applies right now. I don't know what bit we'll be able to see and what we won't. So I'm painting it all. Okay, we're definitely going to need 2 coats. Now here, again, we don't know exactly how much of this is seen because we've not dry fitted the parts, so we don't know how wide it is. So I'm just painting up to the ridge on each side, because that's the ridge we're going to put the part up to when we glue. So make sure you've gone all the way up to the top, you've not left any plastic showing, because believe me, your eye will be drawn straight to it when you've finished. There we go. So whilst that's drying, I can now re-examine these parts, which should be dry, enough to give them a second coat. Yep. So I'm just going to do that quickly. So that's the aluminium painted and finished on that part. And on that part. And I think they'll both look better under a wash, so that's what we'll do. I'm going to go and wash this brush, and then we'll give that a second coat and give those parts a little wash. So we're just doing the second coat of paint now on the air scoops. We're making sure that we've got it all nice and evenly coloured. And it doesn't matter if we do 2 coats or 3 coats, as long as we end up with the paint coverage nice and even. So the paint I'm using is quite thin, so it's going to need 3 coats. Don't be lulled into thinking having thicker paint means you'd have to do less coats, because what thicker paint will do is dry more unevenly and build up a paint where you don't want it, and it could actually ruin your model. So there we go. So whilst that's drying, before we do a third coat, I'm going to take a small amount of paint and thin it with some water like we've done previously, just to make a little wash for the aluminium parts. So let's give that a mix. And again, if you're not sure that it's thin enough, just get a little bit of sprue and draw it across. Yeah, that's fine. So let's start with these which are now touch dry, and all we're doing is dragging it across. And as the water dries, just like it did on the pilot, it will leave the pigment of the paint in some of the recesses. So that should look fairly good. When you put it on your blue tack, make sure you put it nice and flat so it doesn't all run down to one side. That makes sense. Let's do this other little part as well. And there's two big recesses on here that'll stand up really well once that paint's in. You're not going to see these particularly well, but when you deliberately look in, you will see it, and it will look a lot better for it. Okay, let's get this third coat down on this black paint. I'm not going to need to do any washes with this. The advantage of using acrylic paints is it does dry really quite quickly. And leaves a nice... I find a lot of acrylics tend to have a sort of semi-gloss, satin type finish, which for aircraft is spot on. Matte paint, you don't see aeroplanes that are actually flat matte like a lot of the paints that you can buy for models. So you then end up having to put a varnish on. Everything's sort of got a slightly shiny look to it. Now you can see what I'm doing as I put these coats on. I'm deliberately running my brush in the same direction. And that's important, because if you do it in the opposite direction, actually you'll see brush strokes, and it'll take you longer to even that out. Right, 3 is going to be enough for that. So those parts are done. We're going to let that dry properly, let the wash dry properly, then we'll glue them together, and then we're ready to assemble. But what we can do while that lot's all drying is we can move to step 14, which is putting the tail together. So we'll do that while that lot's drying. So step 14 is the assembly of the tail. I'm just going to remove the first part off, which is part B4 there. And what Airfix have done, which is interesting, and a lot of kits don't do, is they've deliberately designed it so that you can have the tail at different positions, which is really nice, because if you're putting this on a stand and you wanted it with the wheels up and it wanted it to look like it's flying, you could tilt the plane and have the flap in the same position. So they haven't done that with the wings, but they've done it with the tail. Now for ease, as this is first build, we're gonna just put it in the straight position, but if you want to put it in that position, it does add a little bit of animation, and that always helps the finished look of a model. If it looks like something's moving, it looks a little bit more realistic. So, but we'll do this straight on. So as normal, just going to give it a bit of a clean up. Now we've removed it from the sprue, make sure that we've got nothing that's going to be visibly wrong when we put paint on it. There's some very nice detail on here, so be careful we don't damage that off. And there we go. part can be held on, and then I'm going to use this extra thin glue. You use the glue that you've got. And we're just going to plop it in there like that. Okay, just make sure that's totally straight. Yeah. Okay, so the next two parts are B10 and B13. So let's take those off as well. Now, my recommendation here is, so that you don't get them the wrong way round, do one at a time and just take one off at a time, because the parts look very similar, and it's quite easily, I've done it, to put them in upside down and not realise that you've made a mistake. So we've just taken off B13, which is for this side. So even though that bit goes into the aeroplane, do trim it up, because it might stop it going in properly if you don't. And I'll just clean that tip of that wing off. Yep, happy with that. Happy with that. No seams to clean up. So let's just do a test dry fit with that. And the fit there is absolutely spot on. I mean, that will hold without glue, but we will put glue in, so put it into position. If you're using a contact glue like this one, this liquid poly here, then put the glue just there on the opening, and then that'll go onto the part as you push it in. For me, I'm going to glue from underneath. Push that in. Right, I'll get the next one done, and then we should be ready to assemble the air scoops. So we're going to do these air scoops now. So I want to show you the easy way of building these up. So first of all, we do need to just clean them up. So use your knife or your cutter and just take away the tabs as closely as you can, and then clean them up. There we go. And then put it back on the blue tack flat. That's going to allow us to keep our hands free when we're gluing these parts on, because they're going to be a little bit fiddly. So again, we'll just trim the tabs off. Now, you trim away and sand down as I've shown you, but I've got experience on my side, so I can probably do it without the filing, which suits me right now. There we go. Okay, so let's start with this small one, which is step 12 in the instructions. And just check which way it should be pointing. So there's a short section and a long section each side of the divide, and this needs to be facing the long section, so that is therefore the front. So I'm just going to clean that edge up, because we know paint's gonna need to be taken off this so that we can put the glue on. Then I'm going to very carefully, this part actually has a slight curve, so I'm going to very carefully take it off with my modelling knife. Put your finger on top so it doesn't flick across the room. In the modelling world, we call it the carpet monster, because what happens is a part flicks off, lands in your carpet, never to be seen again. And no one could actually explain why that happens, that you can never find the part again, but that's what happens. So we're just going to put a very small amount of glue just on that edge there. Now if you've got tweezers, it's really helpful. Obviously you can do it without. If you've got tweezers, you can see what you're doing better. So if you've not got tweezers and you couldn't get any off your mum, you can go and buy them fairly cheaply. Pharmacies generally have them, but find one with as thin an end as you can. Excuse me. Right, so I'm going to do exactly the same with these two parts here, clean them up, glue them in. So when I've done that, we'll come back and show you how to put them on the plane. Okay, so I've assembled these two air scoops. We now need to glue them in place as per step 13, which I'll just show you here. So we're gluing one onto there and one goes into these little grooves here. Now, just to steady the aeroplane and make sure our hands are free, we're going to stick it down with a little bit of blue tack. Now, what's important is we don't damage this bit here, the pilot sticking up. So we're just going to put it on the nose cone there like that and let the tail hold the rest of the plane up, and then just to be sure, I'm going to put a little bit of blue tack either side of the tail just to stop it wobbling about. Okay, so that's a nice easy way of making sure your hands are free without having to worry about buying yourself a vise or something to hold it in. We'll deal with those sort of things in future builds. So the first one I'm going to try and put on is this front air scoop. So I'm just going to dry fit it so I understand how that goes on. Right, okay. Right, so that goes on like that. So the little lump at the back here should stick out of the back. So we're going to put a little bit of glue on the inside edges. Don't get it on your fingers. And then we're going to place it on like so. Okay, now with this one, we'll put the glue in the recess because we know that's where the part's going to sit. And yes, you're right, I didn't dry fit it. Just make sure at this stage that you're getting it the right way round. So this bit that sticks up here faces towards the tail of the plane. There we go. That sits in place nicely like that. So that completes us to the end of stage 14. Now stage 15, we start doing the landing gear, which gets a bit more complex. But before we do that, we're now ready to paint the aeroplane. So before we start putting things that'll be easy to break off, we're going to paint this plane all over black. So let's go and look at that next. So we're now ready to start painting the aeroplane. And I'm going to start painting the underside. We've already got that in the blue tack jigged up so it's nice and stable. So we want to just make sure that that's not going to move whilst we're painting it. I'm going to use two brushes. My rule of thumb is use the biggest brush you can get away with. So a nice flat brush. I do have bigger brushes than this, but you know, if you've got something wider like this, that's ideal. The reason I'm not using this is because this brush is a bit old and doesn't lay the paint down quite as well. So a nice soft flat brush as big as you've got for doing the big surface areas, and then you need a smaller brush that can get into some of the detail that the big brush won't be able to do. So we'll do the big brush first, keeping the small brush clean until the end. And what we'll do is we'll do probably 3 coats, I imagine, and in between each coat we'll let it dry thoroughly, because if you rush it and you put a second coat on and the first one's not dried properly, it's almost pointless, because what you're doing is you're making the first coat move around again. So you need it to dry hard and be more than just touch dry. So we'll start by putting down the paint on the first layer, and what I need to do is make sure the paint gets into all of those little recessed bits of detail, the panel lines. But then when we've done that, we even the paint out, moving it in one direction. And on an aeroplane, I always paint from the top to the bottom in that direction, because that's the direction of wind flow. So if you do have any streaky lines in it, when you finish with it, it just looks like natural weathering and wear and tear. So we put in the paint into the lines first, and then we're just correcting the direction, like so. There we go, and blend it in. Now with acrylic paints, because they dry fairly quickly, it's a bit like felt tip pens. You'll see a line where you've gone over the edge on the first one or two coats, but that will disappear. There we go, and what we want is the paint to be laid fairly evenly, like that. Okay, we can do, with this big brush, we can do the inside of the wheel wells. That's not a problem at all. We might need the smaller brush for some parts of it. In fact, we will. Don't forget to do the sides as well as the bits you can see easily. So keep looking around it, checking that you've covered everything with paint. So I think you get the idea. I'm going to carry on and put the first coat of this down, and I'll come back to you when that's done. So my first coat's dry. I'm about to put the second coat on, so I just wanted to show you quickly how we do that. So we're following exactly the same principle, only we've now got the paint in the panel lines, so we don't need to worry about that quite so much. So what we're going to do is just paint in that direction from, oh, that's not helpful, from front to back, making sure it's nice and even still. So the second coat will go on quicker than the first, because we don't have to get into that detail that's already got paint in it. There we go, and you can already see how much darker that is. And when we come to do the third coat, that will look better again. And everything will even up a little bit. Okay, I'll carry on and do the second coat and show you what that looks like when we're ready to do the third coat. Right, I'm ready to put the third coat on, which I'm hoping will be the last. But before we do that, I just want you to go round, pick your model up, go round, and with your small brush, just make sure that you've got into the ventilators properly, you've gone right up to the edges. Look at it in every different angle, make sure there's nothing that you've missed. When you're happy that you've painted in everything, then go and do your last coat. So I'm just gonna put some paint in. And we're going to do nothing different to what we've done before. We're going to paint in the same direction. Let my brush go hard, that won't help. I'm going to paint in the same direction, and make sure that we've got it nice and thin, nice and even. And once again, you can see the difference that it makes. It's much more even, and the depth of colours changed. So I'm going to carry on and give this a third coat, and we can have a look at what that looks like when we come to paint the top side of the aeroplane. So step 15 here shows these two parts going into the wheel bays there. And basically that's to show the plane in flight with the wheels up. And if you want to build your model in that way, then I would recommend you add these two parts and glue them in place before you paint the black like we've just done. But we're going to build this with the wheels down. So I'm going to leave these parts, which means I can get rid of frame B totally. That's finished with. So we're now going to move on to step 16, and the parts are going to get a bit more delicate now, and I'm going to need some care to take off. I'm still letting the paint dry on the underside. It's touch dry, but I want it to be properly dry before we do the top of the aircraft. So what we're going to do is remove this part first, A22. And I'm going to do it with a knife so I can show you how to do it with the knife because it is a delicate part. So let's identify the part. A22 is here. Right, so that is the bit. That bit there is very, very thin and it's going to break easily. So I'm going to cut that part off first. Okay, so you can see I've cut that away, leaving lots on. It's easier to trim it once the part's off because the part's a funny shape. And then always getting it as close to the mat as you can before you cut it. So I've had to turn the part the other way around. Keep my finger on the part so it doesn't fly off. So there you go. So I've now cut that part off, and then just as before, we're going to trim down, and I'm going to do this thin bit first. And I'm just going to do it a little bit at a time until I get right up to the edge. There we go, like that. And we'll trim this bit off as well. Now, Airfix plastic is slightly softer than most others, and so it does bend a little bit, and actually that really helps with parts not snapping. Okay, so we're going to clean this up. There is a seam. So we're going to just do the seam whilst I've got the knife in my hand. Now these parts are going to get painted aluminium, and the aluminium paint will show up the seams more than any other because it's metal and light bounces off it. The light will bounce off the seam, so make sure that you're happy you've got the seam done. Okay, then we're going to use our sanding stick on some of the heavier seams here. Just want that nice and smooth. And then we're going to sand these tabs down. Now that's not so much of a problem on the thicker parts, but it'd be quite challenging on the thinner part. We'll get to that in a minute. There we go. No tabs there, nice and clean. So on this thinner part, what we're going to do is we're going to hold it as close up to the area that we need to sand and just gently rub across it. We're not really pressing on it at all. It's pressing on it that's going to cause the part to flex and break. So we're just going to gently rub over it, which will slowly wear it down. Now, it's a slower process, but you're going to ensure that your part doesn't break. There we go. Notice there's a seam there that we've not done. Okay, so I'll clean that tab off and then we'll put it in some blue tack ready for painting. So clean the part up, and I just wanted to show you how we're going to mount it in the blue tack. This part here on the end of this hook goes into the wheel, and so we don't want any paint on that. So that's the bit that we're going to put in the blue tack. So we're just going to push that in like that. There we go. And then we can paint the rest of it without having to touch it. So as I look through the instructions, this part here, also aluminium. This part here gets glued onto there, also aluminium. So I'm tempted to glue that part on before I paint. And then we have to do the same on the other side. So we're going to go through steps 16 to 21 quite quickly. So what we'll do is cut the parts off, clean them up as I've shown you. Then we'll glue that bit onto there whilst it's on the blue tack. So we should then have 4 parts to paint ready for assembly. And when we've painted those in the aluminium, we can then go back to finish painting the black paint. Okay, I'll come back to you once we've cleaned up those parts. Right, so I just want to talk about this part here. Like I said, I wanted to glue this on before we painted it, and I have done that. I'll show you. Don't know if the camera's picking that up. It's such a tiny, very fiddly part. What I'd say is if this is your first build, leave it off. It's very difficult to put on. I struggled with it. You've got to cut it off, and you're not going to be able to put it on without a pair of tweezers. And to be honest, it's not important to the finish structurally. If you want to have a go, by all means have a go, but it is very, very fiddly. So I just wanted to say it's okay to leave it off if you want to. I've now cleaned up the other parts. So this part here, which is this rod that strut that holds the whole thing up, all of this is visible. So we're going to use this thick end here, which is the bit that has glue on, and put that in the blue tack for painting. So like so. So you should have 4 parts, 2 of them and 2 of those ready for painting. So we're going to paint those up in aluminium. And I'll show you what they look like when they're done. I'm not going to do anything different to anything we've done before. A little bit of paint, small brush, paint it over, probably 2 coats, and then we'll leave those to dry and we'll come back to painting the rest of the aeroplane black. So whilst the aluminium paint is drying on these parts here, we're ready to paint the top part of the aeroplane in the same black paint as we've done on the underneath. Now what we don't want to be doing now is touching this paint. We want to touch it as little as possible. So how we're going to paint the top is I've wrapped a little bit of tissue paper around one wing, and we're going to hold that and we're going to paint that wing, that top surface, the tail in the black paint, but we're not going to paint this wing. And we're going to do all 3 coats until, just like we did on that side, until we're finished. And then when that's dry and hard, we can then take the tissue paper, wrap it around the painted wing, and paint that last wing 3 times. So we've got 2 stages to paint this. I'm not going to show you me painting this because it's nothing different to that. We're going to paint from front to back, and we're going to do 3 coats until don't worry if it takes you 4 coats, till we've got something that we're happy with. The paint is a nice solid colour. So we're going to do that, and then when we've painted this, before we add those parts, we're going to add the decals. Now, one last thing I wanted to say is, when you come to do your 3rd coat on this first side, take a little bit of that black paint, create yourself a wash, and wash the aluminium parts, because there's lots of detail in these parts, which will come out really nicely under a little bit of black wash. Now, I've shown you how to do a wash, so if you need a reminder, just go back to one of the earlier videos and have a look at it, either the pilot video or washing the inside of the cockpit. So a little bit of black paint, a little bit of water, make it nice and thin, give those parts a wash so that those are dry, and once we put the decals on, we can then fit them. So I'll carry on and paint this and come and show you what it looks like when the whole thing's painted. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so. It's free, and that way you won't miss my first impressions, my tool reviews, my product reviews, and any of my builds, including wooden model kits as well as plastic. It's all free, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can hit my PayPal link in the text below. Every pound goes straight into the channel to keep the cameras rolling and to do more fun stuff for you to watch.